Hello, and welcome to the So You Want to Be a Marine Biologist podcast, where we learn about the ocean, share sea stories, and explore ocean careers. I'm your host, Kara Muzia. Let's dive into today's episode. Have you ever wanted to explore the underwater realm but are unsure how to get dive certified? I've got you covered. Head over to marinebio.life/scuba for beginners and grab your copy of my new scuba guide. In it, I cover the different certifying agencies, gear, lingo, and the number one thing to look out for when you're getting certified. This guide will leave you confident in how to become certified and ready to dive in. Head on over to marinebio.life/scuba for beginners to get your copy and get diving already. marinebio.life/scuba for beginners. Hey, do you want to help the oceans? Have you considered a career in marine biology, but maybe just aren't sure where to start? Head on over to my website, marinebio.life, and subscribe to my newsletter. When you subscribe, you'll receive a free PDF download where you'll learn the 7 steps to becoming a marine biologist without the degree. Hello, mermaids, pirates, ocean lovers, and land lubbers. Welcome to today's show. Question: why are killer whales so good at hunting? They're very well orchestrated. When is a stack of lumber like food in the ocean? When it's a plankton. Erich Hoyt has spent much of his life on or beside the ocean working with whales and dolphins. He is a noted conservationist, scientist, and an award-winning author, and he actually wrote the first ever book on orcas, or killer whales. A former Vannevar Bush Fellow at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Erich is currently a research fellow at Whale and Dolphin Conservation, co-chair of the IUCN Marine Mammal Protected Areas Task Force, and author of the new book Planktonia, The Nightly Migration of the Ocean's Smallest Creatures from Firefly Books. In this episode, we chat about making a living from passion projects, Erich's work with orcas, and all about the greatest migration on Earth that happens twice a night, every night, in the deep blue sea. Please enjoy. Erich, welcome to the So You Want to Be a Marine Biologist podcast.
Hi, Kara. Really great to be here and great to have a chance to talk to you.
Yeah. So I'm so excited to chat with you today and learn more about your story. It was really fun researching you and just the amazing things that you've done. I want to take it back to the beginning a little bit with you. You grew up in the American Midwest and you moved to Canada later on, but how did you get interested in whales? I mean, the American Midwest is not anywhere near any oceans at all, and a large body of your work is centered around the ocean.
When I was young, I started visiting on vacation, the Atlantic, going over to New Jersey, Atlantic City, before the casino time it wasn't quite sleepy, but it was a place where you could touch real ocean and swim in it and jump the waves and all of that. And I determined from those early days that I was always going to live by the ocean. And so when I left home, having made other trips, to Maine and West Coast and that sort of thing, I decided that I was going to go to Canada and go out to the West Coast, to Vancouver and Vancouver Island, get a cottage on the beach and look at the waves and see what was out there. And at that time, I had no interest, no knowledge or interest in whales. And it was just, a couple of years later that I got invited as a sound man on a short documentary film to try to find killer whales or orcas in the wild off northern Vancouver Island. And so 4 of us very naively set sail in an engineless sailboat, 32-foot sailboat, which was a bit crazy because we didn't have a lot of sailing experience either. I mean, one of us did, fortunately. But we had all these disasters at the beginning, losing a man overboard, fortunately recovered, running into the rocks, wandering from Canadian waters into the San Juans. And, it was pathetic, really, beginning. But we got our act together and braved a few storms and got up to northern Vancouver Island, and lo and behold, found these killer whales, orcas. I think I'm going to call them orcas. That's more what we use. Although still, when you're a scientist studying them, you use the term killer whales in the literature. So, but orcas is easier, and it's, it reflects more of what they're like. So we found these orcas, and the amazing thing was that we realized pretty soon that you could identify them as individuals. So and we started giving names for them. So there was Stubbs, who was an older female with a kind of jagged dorsal fin. That's the top fin on the whales. And Nicola had a little slice or a nick near the top of her fin. And Wavy was a big bull with, a wavy back, back part of his trailing edge of his fin. And so we started to see that these whales had, that this is where they were hanging out, because day after day we would see them. We had about 3 months that first summer, and that was a turning point for me. I kept, I've always kept a journal, so I had journals about that, and about halfway through that summer, somebody named Michael A. Big, who was commissioned to study the whales in a formal way to see if they should be taken for captivity, whether there were too many being taken, because there was no census. This is early 1970s. We knew nothing about them. A lot of people thought they were dangerous, highly dangerous, although they were already starting to prove, in captivity not to be so dangerous. But anyway, he developed this photographic identification method to identify each individual orca from its dorsal fin and the saddle patch right behind the dorsal fin, sometimes using the eye patch, that white patch that orcas have. And the amazing thing was that it was not just that you could identify a few of them like we had done with Stubbs and Nicola and Wavy, but every single orca could be identified in this method, and these were long-lived markings that they had. So over, theoretically, we thought, well, if we came back, maybe we'd see them again. Right. So that's how I got started. So I was not a biologist. I just became obsessed with them, and that's always a good recipe for, getting your feet wet and getting totally into a subject, and so it was just going back year after year and just really absorbing all of that and working with the scientists, and eventually, there's a lot of, I don't want to flash forward too far because there are a lot of other steps, but it was learning by accretion, but learning with the scientists and then becoming a scientist myself in that process. That was a sort of organic way of doing it. So it's not, I don't have a PhD. I don't have the usual letters after my name, but I write lots of papers and do all that work that's fun to do.
Yeah. And I feel like nowadays the PhD has become just, well, it's something I want to do my research, so I feel like I have to get the PhD in order to do the research. And I really like the path that you took, is that I found my passion and I was able to learn and grow from there and actually get that experience and know that's really what you wanted to do. And you just did it.
And that's actually been the way I've lived my life. I was determined, along with wanting to live by the sea always, which I've pretty much kept to, a short period in the mountains of British Columbia, not counting that. But I think following your interest, it's the most efficient way to learn anything and to do things. If you're not excited by what you're doing, it's hard work, if you could figure out a way. This was my challenge in my 20s, was how to figure out a way of making a living, supporting myself, and eventually a family, but doing what I wanted to do, not necessarily working 9 to 5, ideally not working at all 9 to 5, just working all the time on what you wanted to do.
Yeah. Before we continue with your story, I want to circle back. You said you use killer whales in literature, but primarily orcas. So, why? I guess I always call them orcas for clarification because they're not actually whales. They're cousins of the dolphin. So, why is that used in literature?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think because some of the first scientists who wrote about them used it in literature. That's kind of a weird answer, but it's probably down to that, because a common name, common names are just common names, and they can change over time. And some species have alternate common names. And actually, if you look in the encyclopedias and books, they always say killer whale or orca. So technically, it has the other common name as well. So either one could be used. But I think it's just convention. But if you submit a paper to a journal and you've called them orcas, they're going to think it's a kind of woolly research, So you have to use the term killer whale in a formal way. It's like using somebody's first and last name, maybe,
Yeah, I did not know that. That's really interesting. And I like that. I didn't realize that you could use, so I knew with the dorsal identification, that's fairly uniform, I think, across all cetaceans. I know dolphin researchers, they do dorsal shots for identification as well. But the saddle patch and the eye as well, I didn't realize that those could be helped to identify individuals. Makes sense.
You use whatever you could get, I mean, there was one whale, female whale, who had a tumor at the side of her head, we don't know how it happened, but it was something that was very identifiable. But in fact, with a lot of dolphins, yes, as you say, the dorsal fin is key, but humpback whales, it's tails, the underside of their flukes. And right whales, it's the callosities, the whitened, roughened patches around the head, Yeah, and that's really, really unique to each individual if you get a sharp photograph of it. So it's
like their freckles. Their freckles are unique.
Yeah, those techniques evolved from plains of Africa, where they'd started to identify elephants by the little nicks on their ears, and giraffes from the spots. Apparently, the spots in giraffes are unique for each one. Those patterns, which I find amazing. I mean, I can't see it at all, but my friends who are giraffe scientists can see it.
That's so cool. Yeah, I didn't know that either. It makes sense. I know they have different gradients in color, but I haven't really paid attention to the pattern differences. Kind of like whale sharks and manta rays. They have the different patterns identifying. Nature is just so fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
So cool. So you're doing this research. What inspired you to start writing your own books? I mean, was Orca the Whale Called Killer your first book?
Yes, that was my first book.
What inspired that?
Well, I just was spending all those summers out with them in the wild, and realizing that, there was no book on killer whales.
You wrote the book.
Yeah, which was really, surprising to me. And so I started with it, pitching articles, to National Geographic and Defenders and other American and Canadian magazines, and British BBC Wildlife. And I was selling articles to all these places, and then realizing more and more, this is a book and I really should try and do it. And I thought I would just dash off a book, and it took me 4 years of embarrassing apprenticeship with lots of drafts. I think it worked out to something like 13 drafts in the end. And then trying to sell it, I tried on my own for a while, and I had some interest, and then it fell through. And then, one thing after another, I finally got one publisher to recommend an agent. and she sent it to 22 publishers who turned it down.
Wow.
And the 23rd accepted it. So it was, it was a saga, of 4 years, but it got published. And then, all I wanted from that book was hopefully a good review or two. And it had amazing reviews, and, it's still in print today. So it's like 40 years later I've done new editions of it every once in a while. So I did one a couple years ago, the same title, but it's kind of the story of I always say the story of my misspent youth, because I used journal entries in it as well as the science and how we were learning it step by step. And, seeing that, the day that we found orcas feeding side by side with minke whales, and we'd read these accounts of them eating minke whales. Well, why were they feeding side by side? And then you learn that actually they're eating salmon, and we finally saw them eating salmon, which took quite a while. It turns out that they're dedicated salmon eaters, and even of only a small number of salmon species, the Chinook in particular. My great luck was to be able to see these things as we were learning them, and so I could recreate the idea that when we didn't know anything, and then we learned it step by step, and the excitement of that, and initially maybe thinking, is it true or isn't it, or and then you find out. So like a detective.
Right. How exciting is that? You're like groundbreaking killer whale research, orca research, right? Like, that is so cool.
It was luck. As I say, I didn't come to it with a big interest in whale, only the ocean. The ocean got me there, I guess. So that has kept as a constant through my life in all the other topics, all the other areas of research and also popular writing that I've done, centered on the ocean.
So I am curious, like we said, and like we talked about, like a lot of your work focuses on whales specifically, but just the ocean in general. But you've written a book about ants, and like you've kind of gone down other rabbit holes. What inspired those? I mean, I know the Earth Dwellers, your book about ants, was a trip to Costa Rica with E.O. Wilson, who is just probably one of the most popular and well-known naturalists in the world. So I thought that was fascinating that you got to go on that trip. How did that come about?
Well, yes, that's my excursion away from the ocean. So, but I had a fellowship at MIT, and in the late '80s, mid '80s, 1980s, and you could take any courses you wanted at Harvard and MIT. And I'd always, I knew about E.O. Wilson, and I thought, well, that's a good way to learn evolutionary biology. So it was his introductory course that he taught, along with, Stephen Jay Gould was in the next lecture hall doing it from a more geological point of view. So I had the two of them for that full year going back to back. And I just started talking, and E.O. Wilson he was such a great teacher. He kind of had this method of just going on bended knee to the audience or to the reader when he writes, and to really communicate, to make sure he was being understood, and had all these strategies for doing it. Very clever. And that was, in a way, a different kind of apprenticeship in looking at how he had led his life and how he'd studied animal societies, and starting with ants, who were his totemic species, that he first collected in the fields in Alabama and then gone up to Harvard. So I got to know him, and then was just lucky. He invited me on an expedition to Costa Rica with his mentor, who had first brought him to Harvard, and they had not been in the field for 30 years.
Wow.
So they were just, tearing up the place. They were laughing and stories, and they let me turn on the tape recorder and just leave it on. So I had a week of just amazing material and, very, very rich, a week or 2 weeks almost, I think. And then after that, and then I was thinking that was an article. I was thinking that that's going to be a fantastic article. Because my approach to doing these things, if I'm doing a popular work, is to bring the reader into the field and to really make them feel and smell it and taste it and hear everything that's going on. And the method for doing that is really to get far more material than you're ever going to need. And then also get it in such detail that you can really recreate the scene for your reader. So after writing a couple articles, it started growing on me that could be a book, and I talked a lot more to Wilson and to Bill Brown, the mentor who was in the field with him, and spent time with him he was at Cornell up at Ithaca. And the more I thought about it and, read a lot of the stuff, which was all foreign to me, that whole literature, I didn't know anything about ants to start with, but I was learning fast. But I also, taking it back to the ocean and to whales, I also thought, here's social behavior on a micro scale. So you can get 30 different species of ants on a single log in the rainforest. And some of them would be discrete. They'd be so small that the whole world, the whole population or colony of that ants, not the whole population, but the whole colony would be in something, like a foot across, and you can discretely study that. And because workers are like cells, you can study casts by removing some workers. You can do some kinds of acceptable manipulation that you certainly cannot do with charismatic social mammals. So it was interesting, and I could see that they could learn a lot about social behavior and evolutionary biology much faster than we could, and I started to appreciate how difficult it was what we were trying to do with the whales. That it was, we'd taken on the most difficult species to try and piece together social behavior, for example. And that's why it's really taken decades for all these scientists working all over the world to come up with the kinds of things in entomology you could have done in 4 or 5 years.
Hey, Kara here. I hear it all the time. How do I become a marine biologist? Or my niece wants to help the ocean. Where does she even start? I hear from students, yes, and also nurses, HR professionals, and other mid-career folks who wonder if they could still make their dream of working with sea turtles or sharks come true, wondering if it's too late to answer the ocean's call. Here's what I've learned after 20 years in the field and hundreds of interviews. There's no straight line, no magic degree, and no gatekeeper. You create the path forward. If this sounds overwhelming and vague, I've created 2 tools to help you stop wondering what if and start moving forward with clarity and purpose. The first is my free guide, Be a Marine Biologist Without the Degree. Over 1,000 people have already downloaded this guide and taken their first step towards ocean impact. Inside, you'll find 7 concrete, doable actions to help you get started, whether you're just exploring or ready to make a change. Then there's the Ocean Blueprint. This is a 30-day self-paced course that helps you build your unique path into ocean science and conservation without quitting your job or going back to school. Inside the Ocean Blueprint, you'll get daily prompts to explore your interests, skills, and next steps, a structure that turns overwhelm into real momentum, and a bonus section to root your work into ocean connection. You don't have to wait for a degree, a perfect plan, or permission. Whether you're wading in or ready to take the deep dive, these tools are here to help you move from dreaming to doing. The ocean called. Are you ready to answer? Links in the show notes and on my website, karagracemusia.com. I can't wait to see the waves you'll make. That's amazing. So you had already written your first book before you went to Harvard and met E.O. Wilson and took his class and everything.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And a couple other books too before that. Yeah.
So I'm curious, I feel like you had already established yourself as an author, and like he's written a massive amount of articles and books as well. Did working with him, did that influence your writing at all and kind of give you a different perspective on it, or just kind of like helped you grow as a writer a bit?
It did help me grow as a writer. I was thinking that, I liked the way our schedule in the jungle was like going out very, very early in the morning, before dawn when the orapendula are screaming in the trees, the birds, and getting out there and doing a day's work before lunchtime. And then after lunch, Wilson would take a 20-minute nap, and I was bunking. I had the top bunk, so I could hear him, but he never snored or anything. But he got out of bed, and then he would just go right, straight outside the cabin, which were right at the edge of the rainforest, and sit in a chair and write a chapter. He had it in his head. I know he had an amazing editor who worked in his office, Kathleen Horton, who stayed with him, I think, worked on most of his books with him and stayed there. She'd probably do some of the references and, things like that. But he did it without a fuss, just because he loved doing it. So I think it was his enthusiasm and, positivity, rather than making it a big chore to write, which a lot of writers do, and I'm certainly guilty of it sometimes. Because it's hard. You're not meant to come up with something reasonable in one draft, or even 3 or 4 drafts sometimes. It's not how well you write, it's how well you rewrite in a lot of cases. But he was an inspiration.
Yeah. I really like that. It's not how well you write, it's how well you rewrite. Because the first draft you're like, oh, it's okay. But you have to keep going at it. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and that also relieves you of the stress of writing that first draft if you keep that in your mind, because you're not going to make it perfect. Just get the best you can down on paper, and then you massage it, and you start to work it. And then, I have a process of generally writing in longhand, but sometimes on the computer, but then printing out drafts, editing on paper works for me. And then I input the corrections and start again, fresh looking paper and version, and, take it out to a cafe or something like that where you can get some headspace that's clear without any distractions, and give it pretend you didn't write it, but you're just trying to, make it good. It's a process rather than something that you write it and that's it.
Right. That makes perfect sense. So your writing, it really, what you did to describe E.O. Wilson's methods, right? You said he gets on bended knee and really tries to draw the readers in. That's how I felt with your writing. You really made it very relatable, and it was just simple to understand. And I was curious, what methods you approach it with. Like, how do you cater to the reader as well as you do? Because I found it very relatable. And some of the subject matter that you're covering, is higher level stuff, really. It could just be a scientific paper, but you break it down so that it's not just facts and figures and whatever, but it's actually interesting. You're telling a story while you do it.
Well, thanks a lot for saying that. I mean, that's exactly what I'm trying to do, whether I succeed all the time. It's really, it is, a lot of it is to try to reach readers. I think you need to imagine them, and you have to almost become them in a way. Certainly when you're editing, you have to read it in that kind of fresh way, as if you don't know anything about it. And that is difficult. You cannot do it right after you write a first draft. You have to put them away, or you have to go somewhere else to do it. I do, at least, physically have to go away, usually maybe next day, to edit what I might have written the previous day. And then just really look at it from, make sure you're taking readers step by step through information, experience, narrative. If you can get the sense of narrative with writing, then whenever humans get the idea that there's a story involved, there's a piquing of interest. So I think it's just doing that over and over again, and making a lot of mistakes, but, gradually getting to the point where you can start to do it. I used to write lots of rules for writing and editing and have them up all over the room, and but I think it becomes, after a while, some of them are in there. Doesn't mean I write any better for first drafts. They're still miserable. I always remember, I don't know if you remember the American humor writer James Thurber. He was early New Yorker. He was one of the three people who made the New Yorker what it is. And I was lucky to have a Thurber writer in residence years ago. And one of the things I came across was this story from his wife. And this is a brilliant, brilliant writer. And the story from his wife was that she'd found some writing that he was doing on the top of their piano. And she said, "Christ, Thurber, this is high school stuff." And she just, thought, but, he was pointing out, well, that's an early draft, there's a lot more to go on it. Yeah, I think that's what it is. So, keep at it, people who are writing out there. The other thing to say about writing is it's an amazing way to get involved in marine biology or in any science subject, because if you can write, there are all sorts of employment opportunities, that present themselves. You can write your way into a lot of different jobs if you can do it well.
Could you give a couple of examples? Like, I have some ideas in head.
Well, in the first place, you can pitch. So many of the ideas I've had over the years, and not just book ideas, but ideas for conservation projects and science projects, go back to an email or a letter, originally a letter, but an email, and one page, not long, but very persuasive. So persuasive writing at the very basic level, if you can do that really well, you're going to have a much better chance of getting a job. I have a lot of people who write to me who want to, do something related to killer whales, want advice, or want, think that I have a university position, which I don't have, but, they write to me, and I could sort out, I could tell you that 1% of them have written an engaging letter that would make me want to hire them. Of course, I'm not in a position to do it. There are a couple of people over the years that I've taken on as apprenticeship type thing, but, and that was a very, very good letter, and it sort of opens the discussion, and then you talk to them and maybe they write more. But anything you can do to improve your writing, I think that's one of the tools in the toolbox for scientists that, and you have to have that if you're going to convince people of conservation and, to get your science out into the world. And if you can use social media to do it as well, that's another kind of writing, as it were. It's pithy, it's short, but it's very, very important. Even those tweets,
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So again, you've done a lot on whales and cetaceans, but you've taken these other rabbit holes. You've taken these other side roads, right? So what inspired these? You've written about creatures of the deep. Your new book is about plankton. What inspires these other deviations from the killer whales?
Well, the whales certainly got me, thinking about other creatures in the sea. And the first book I did in that, I have a sort of creatures, I call it the creatures books. And there are four of them now, and maybe growing. But the first one was Creatures of the Deep, which, took readers layer by layer to the bottom of the ocean. In one of the narratives, I had 4 narratives in the book. And the second was going from the smallest, the plankton, up to large predators, the whole pyramid. And the third was more of a geological approach, going along the world's longest mountain range, which is under the sea, and finding the hydrothermal vents, that there was life going down there far below the sea where there was, no photosynthesis going on. And how could it possibly exist? And at fabulous temperatures, hotter than pizza ovens, much hotter than pizza ovens. And then the fourth part I did was looking at the census of marine life. So the challenge to try to come to grips with how many species there were in the sea. And we still haven't done it. But the census of marine life over 10 years, which concluded in 2010 or 2011, found another couple 100,000 species. Was it a couple 100,000 or was it 20,000? Ooh. No, I think it was only 20,000 species because that's right, it's about 2,000 a year that we're discovering or that we're identifying.
Just mind-boggling. 2,000 species a year, and we're still going. Like, there's just so much unknown on our own planet.
I know. It's and some people say it's much less known than the moon and of course, there isn't the diversity on the moon of life, but in terms of mapping the bottom of the sea, just a tiny fraction. Estimates of the number of species in the sea could be 1 million. Maybe we know 250,000, 260,000, I think it is now. There's a lot more that we don't know than what we do know. And so that attracts me, and that attracted me to that book. And also the fact that at that time, when I wrote the first edition of Creatures of the Deep, there'd only been one expedition ever to the bottom of the sea. And that was that one in 1960.
The Trieste.
Yeah, in Trieste, yeah, famous. And then when I did the second edition of Creatures of the Deep 10 years later, or 8, I could forget how many, Cameron had gone down, the Titanic director. And so I could talk about that as well. And that was really exciting. And now there's a third person, Victor Vescovo, who is going down every other week. I mean, he's really cracked it because the other 2 vehicles that went to the bottom, they were retired after that. They were worried. They thought the intense pressure, of being so far down, they were not going to survive if they used that vehicle again. But Vescovo has managed to develop a sturdy vehicle, I guess, and he's taken all kinds of people down there. I would give anything to go down there. And I'm, who knows, but that would be a dream. But now he's gone down to other deepest parts and other parts of the ocean and, made a lot of concrete scientific findings, as well as alerted people to the importance of protecting the bottom, and how much we don't know, and we really need to invest a lot more in learning about that.
Yeah, especially as we look into, there's some mining talks in the deep sea ocean, which we're just kind of like putting bulldozers in unknown lands, and we don't know anything about it. We haven't mapped it. We don't know what's really there and what we're doing. So it's good points. I try to bring that up because we don't know. We don't know. There's so much out there that we just have no idea. And it's important to understand if we're going to mess with it, right? If we're just going to leave it alone, it's fun to know. But if we're going to mess with it, we need to know. It's important.
Yes, and we are messing with it in a big way, more and more. And so that book really led me into doing a younger kids book called Weird Sea Creatures, just sort of celebrating the wonderful weirdness down there. And then I did another one called Strange Sea Creatures. The publisher gives the names, and sometimes
publishers like, this is what's going to sell.
Yeah, exactly. So that one had more in different layers, and one of the layers was the upper layer where the plankton's coming, and I started to get really interested in this plankton because it was macro photography at night in the open ocean, and I had a handful of pictures of that in Strange Sea Creatures, and I thought, I started looking around and getting thousands of photographs to look at and talking to people who were doing this. And it was really new stuff, in the last few years, this idea of Blackwater photography. And so that's how I just got interested and decided, that had to be a book. The interesting thing was partly that we thought about a kid's book and fairly short, like 80 pages or 90 pages. And as I was working on the book, I realized this subject is bigger and bigger. And so I started writing more and, bringing different areas of the world. So there's the Gulf Stream off Florida, and there's Japan and Philippines, the White Sea in Russia, in the Arctic, and a few other areas. And I realized that there was a great citizen science story here. There was a conservation story because these areas needed to be looked at for protection, which they weren't being, And there was this fantastic story of how they were getting the photographs in these difficult conditions, and, who had done it first, a little bit of history, and then it all in the background of the world's greatest migration, arguably.
It is. And it happens every day.
Every day at night.
Yeah, every night, twice a night.
And, and that's it. For me to call it the greatest migration, I've worked with humpbacks, and, it's kind of like going against my whale side. It's in terms of the number of individuals and the number of species that are doing this. It has to be the many, many trillions. And the fact that it happens twice every night, coming up from the deep, not the absolute deep, but deep waters, up to the top and then back down before sunrise. I think it qualifies for greatest.
It's amazing. It really is. And it's like millions of individuals, right? Like whales might be hundreds.
And the funny thing is, before World War II, actually during World War II, the German U-boats, they were able to suddenly, with sonar, figure out, they were trying to measure the bottom or trying to look at the bottom, and they kept noticing that the bottom of the sea was moving up every night, it was just completely puzzling. And it was only after World War II with studying lanternfish and seeing that there was this movement going on, from the depths up, and seeing that it was consistent over the ocean. I think one of my favorite whale biologists, Georges Cuvier in France, who's the Cuvier's beaked whale is named after him. He had actually noticed it in a pond, that there was this vertical migration at night. But, people thought, well, that's that pond, and for some reason it has this weird behavior. But in fact, it's happening everywhere from Arctic to tropics and in ponds. So it's pretty interesting.
It's all connected. Look at that. Ponds to the great big ocean, tropical to Arctic. Amazing in Antarctic. So did you go Blackwater diving? Have you gone?
I haven't been. It's all vicarious for me. To be able to describe it, I mean, I talked to so many Blackwater divers, and particularly, Mike Bartik, was helpful in completely recreating the sensation of diving, and I put that whole section in the book. But I'm not a diver, and with some of my medical conditions, I can't dive now. So I'm vicarious. So I can live through the photographs, which are absolutely stunning, and the people who do it, and appreciate their artistry from the top. But I will say, one of my first times of getting interested about this actually goes back to being out in a small boat. We had all-night whale watches for orcas. When we were trying to figure out what their behavior was like. And I would go out there. I love this part of the trip because you go out in a dinghy, and you'd go even a mile or more out, and the phosphorescence, as the trails of seals and fish were going by, were always fascinating. And then I just started with a light looking down, and I could see it was a really rich plankton environment that was supporting all the salmon and all the life that was going on there. So even from the surface at night, you got a lot of time on your hands while you're waiting for orcas at night. I could appreciate and see what was going on down below, and it was stunning and intriguing.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. So I don't think we define what Blackwater diving is. So for listeners, Blackwater diving is not only diving at night, but you're not going to the bottom like you usually do for diving. You're diving in potentially hundreds of feet of water, usually hundreds of feet of water.
Or 5,000 feet.
Or 5,000 feet of water. And you're not going down that deep, obviously. You can't, but you're going down like maybe 50-ish feet, maybe 100, starting there and working your way shallower, according to some of these photographers that I was reading their stories of. But it's all of these amazing deep sea creatures coming up at night. So like there's photographs of the blanket octopus in here, which is just so fun, and like tiny baby paper nautiluses, which is, amazing. I learned that salps are actually, so listeners, salps are like a translucent, I don't know how to describe totally what they look like. They're gelatinous. They're a tunicate. They're like a colony of little tunicates that move along the water column. And they don't look like much. They just look like a chain of clear blobs, basically, but they move along on their own volition. And I learned in this book that they're actually habitat. There's so many pictures of so many different creatures just living on these seemingly translucent blobs of nothing, and they're not. They're just a little ecosystem.
Yeah, they become an ecosystem as well. It's interesting. It's like the rainforest too. You get the plants living on plants, and on top of other plants, and then insects within at the top of the rainforest, living in that whole system, multiple insects. It is a whole other world. I think the Blackwater, should we say it started with blue water? Because there were a few photographers who were starting to just get dropped off or take their boat out far enough to just dive in the daylight. There was a pioneer photographer in Hawaii named Chris Newbert who started do it at night, and a little bit dangerously, I think, originally, but
as most pioneers are, they live a little dangerously.
They push the envelope, and but amazing photographs. He did a landmark book that when we saw this in the 1980s, I think, it had, creatures as you'd never seen them before, but not macro photography really, so that really is something that's, the lenses we have today and the lights are a big part of it too, being able to light the area enough to take the photographs but not scare everybody away, all the animals. I mean, some of them will go down, and some are attracted to light, so you're not necessarily getting a statistical sample, but you're getting so much interesting life, right, and new species.
And that's the other part of it, right? Like traditionally plankton research, and you mentioned this in the book as well, is done by plankton tows, right? They literally have a net called plankton net, and you tow it behind a boat usually. And it has a little cup at the bottom that collects all the samples. And you just see what you get. But the problem is you're towing at a high velocity usually. And so you're kind of crushing things as you go along. These are tiny, teeny, tiny little animals, and they're fragile. So taking out that movement pattern, right? And that like capturing, the only thing you're capturing is their image, and you're not physically touching them usually. So you can get so much detail.
Yeah, that's perfectly described. And there are some of the photographers now and citizen scientists who are working with Smithsonian and other scientists to take a sample, and they actually resist touching anything. It has the ethic of leaving them as they are, but they've agreed to take some for DNA barcoding, very, very small number, and they have to be collected very carefully. The photograph remains the key thing, because those flamboyant fins on a flounder, are destroyed if they get crushed. And so if you want to see what all the barbels, the hanging parts coming off them, because the evolution of planktonic creatures in a lot of cases is completely different from the adults, the evolutionary pressures on them, so that that's why they look so differently as, juveniles and larvae compared to the adults. And that's been a fantastic advance, because the DNA plus the photographs in many cases have allowed scientists to link the two. They didn't necessarily know it was the same species. Suddenly you realize, well, just to take a flounder, for example, suddenly you realize a flounder as larvae has eyes on either side of its head and has this fabulous fin that looks like, an old style lady's hat with a feather and everything coming out. And then when they settle at the bottom, as they do as adults, the one eye moves to the other side of the head, so they're both on the same side. They lose the fins. It all changes, and they spend the rest of their lives not colorful as they were as youngins, but right in the mud and the sand at the bottom, with both eyes looking up and trying to hide. So it's completely different strategy, and that's one same species.
It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. So I want to flip-flop for a minute with you. Something I was really curious about, we're going back to whales. You literally wrote the handbook on whale watching, which I thought was really interesting. And you kind of I read a little bit of the history about whale watching. It literally was like $1 to go out and see gray whales, started in San Diego, California. And now it's grown into this like $2 billion worldwide industry. So I was really curious on some of your perspectives on whale watching, because I know it can be controversial with, a lot of the times when whales are aggregating, it's because they're mating, and we don't want to have tons of boats out there interfering with that. But in the same time, like it's kind of like aquariums and zoos, right? It inspires people when they see these animals, and it provides that ability to connect with them. So there's that side to just bring the public into a domain that they wouldn't usually be able to see. So I was kind of curious on your perspective on whale watching and some of your tips from your handbook?
Well, it's a good question, and it's topical because we are rethinking the way we whale watch, and I think early on we saw whale watching as all good and something that could only, get people interested in the ocean and conservation and everything, which it still does, of course. And we saw the benefits to to the whales in terms of research that went into them, because there was a lot of science that was conducted, for example, off Provincetown in Boston for years, and still happens through, for example, Center for Coastal Studies working with the dolphin fleet, who were the first whale watching company on the east coast of the U.S. And there were many papers that came out of that work, and science, some good science, PhDs, all kinds of stuff, because they had naturalists who were prospective scientists on all the boats. So there's been tremendous benefits. But as whale watching has grown, we, as you say, have started to think about how it's affecting the whales themselves, and we've started to study, over the last 20 years, the effects on whales, and there are demonstrations of, if I take whales in the larger sense of all whale species and dolphins, there are cases now of populations that are distracted from feeding or nursing and that sort of thing by being whale watched intensively. And I think, we have to do it more carefully. I think it needs to be spread out. So when I'm asked this, and I do speak about whale watching still, and in fact, going to be at a conference, the main conference on marine protected areas, which is held every few years, called International Marine Protected Area Congress. And it's going to be in Vancouver in February. And I'll be speaking also on whale watching there too, and how to manage it in the context of marine protected areas, like the national marine sanctuaries around the U.S. And so I have thought a lot about this. I think we need to spread our footprint on the water. We talk about having a light footprint when we go into a national park or something. It's similar out there. And, the way we do that is, I think, by not targeting whales so much, looking at the whole ocean, spending time showing people other species, certainly by keeping a distance. Stepping back for a minute, the problem with whales, it's not a problem. It's not their problem. It's our problem, is that they're curious and they come by our boat or whatever. And we take that they love us, and we get a reinforcement from it. Everybody does. Scientists do as well. And there is some recognition with populations that you study regularly. But that builds an expectation in customers, in prospective whale watchers. They want to go out there and have that experience. And if you demand that experience, if there are only 100,000 whale watchers in the world, that's probably easily tolerable. But if you've got, now the latest estimates, I think, went up to about 13 million globally watching whales. Could well be more now, although of course we had a gap with COVID. But if you have that many people wanting close encounters, that's trouble. That's impossible. There aren't enough whales to go around, and people used to say, or not too long ago, you have to be careful of not hugging the whales to death. It's really, so you have to have respect. And I think we do have to get back to a more ecological way, the way you watch birds. You don't go up to a bird and, try to interact with it. You're actually quietly behind a blind, and you're trying to witness natural behavior. If we think about trying to witness natural and how exciting it is to see natural behavior rather than to see them just coming over to us, and use your binoculars and sometimes they will come over anyway because they are curious. So, but boats that are actually going after them, that's really the insidious thing that's happened and has become really common, even though it's natural. You want to give your customers a good time, but we have to be mature about it, and also, you look at land-based whale watching. Land-based, you don't disturb them. It's absolutely fabulous in some parts of the world. California coast for gray whales. A few years ago, I drove down the California coast and kept stopping, because there are gray whales coming up and it was just, and then I was in Monterey and went jogging as I do every other day and saw 4 species in one day along Monterey Bay, just outside of Monterey. Gray whales, Rizzo's dolphins, killer whales, and humpbacks. And there they were all out there, and some of them fairly close. So it is possible to do some of this without disturbing them. You have to take a bit more time to do it and thoughtfulness.
And more patience, right? I mean, your example of bird watching, I can't think of anything that requires more patience other than maybe golf. But I think bird watching still takes I think bird watching still takes the cake on that one.
Yeah. So and if you see these BBC fabulous wildlife programs they put together on Planet Ocean and all of that, those photographers, filmmakers spend many days and weeks to get one shot. So they have the patience that really we all should start to acquire, I think, along with golfers and bird watchers.
I want to get into your current role right now, and I'm going to read it because you got a couple titles here. So you're a research fellow at the Whale and Dolphin Conservation, and you're a co-chair at the IUCN Marine Mammal Protected Areas Task Force. What does that mean? It seems like those roles tie together really neatly and nicely. And what do you do with those as fellows and researchers?
Yes, so they are together, those two roles. But the co-chair of the task force for the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which is on marine mammal protected areas, is a sort of focused way to get some of the work I do with whale and dolphin conservation into a different world, into some of the larger policy-oriented and conservation-oriented world in different countries. Whale and Dolphin Conservation is a charity that was set up in the UK in late 1980s, and I started working for them a few years after they were started. They have a branch, a separate group, that's part of us in North America, based near Boston, and also one in Germany. And so, we attempt to work on whales globally. So my part of it was spatial, thinking about what are the spatial needs of whales and dolphins. And this actually went back to my killer whale work when we learned really that those whales that like Wavy and Stubbs and Nicola were coming back every summer. So it was the same whales we were seeing every year. Sometimes a few new ones, but mostly the same individuals. And that suddenly meant that they had spatial requirements, I mean, there was this idea before that why do you need to protect whales or make protected areas for them? Because they're out there in the ocean, they're swimming around, and, they've got the whole ocean. What do you want, But in fact, when we found out that they are coming back to the same areas repeatedly, and they have what's called site fidelity. We call it site fidelity. And that it was true not only of orcas, but it was true of humpback whales, going back to Hawaii and the Dominican Republic, coming back up to Massachusetts and Stellwagen Bank. And the more we studied different whales, the more we found it was true with a lot of them. And the same with pinnipeds and sirenians and other marine mammals. So I wrote this book on marine protected areas for whales, which was a technical book. And in the process of that, did a lot of research to find all the areas worldwide where there was some protection for them in existing areas. Then I put it all on a map, and we had a lot of maps in the book, but I also put it on a big wall size map. And, you looking at it, what you realize is that these areas where there's some protection for whales and other marine mammals are just along the coastlines and around islands. And so there's this great, huge area of the ocean, all the high seas. The high seas is international waters, which is more than half of the ocean, but also even national waters that are, further than a little bit out than the coast. And nobody's doing anything there. And also the marine protected areas that were created might have started out with a whale habitat idea, but then when they bring them in front of stakeholders and policymakers, the maps get redrawn, and so you might get a fraction of what's their actual habitat was. So that's where this task force came from. Through my work with Whale and Dolphin Conservation, and in 2013, we decided we needed to really go back and look ocean by ocean at all the marine mammal habitats, potential habitats, and bring the scientists together in a series of regional workshops. So we've had 8 so far, covering almost half the ocean, mostly through the southern hemisphere. We had substantial funding from government funding and foundations, and bringing these people together, these scientists together, who were experts on blue whales and humpbacks and Galapagos sea lions and that sort of thing, and then trying to create candidate important marine mammal areas that then went for peer review. So very, very tough audience of 3 or 4 panel of peer reviewers, because that's the process of science, and then coming up with areas that we could have confidence for, and this could be a consistent method for doing this around the ocean. So it takes about 8 months to do one region. We just did the Eastern Tropical Pacific from Mexico, actually tropical and temperate. So we did Mexico to Chile, just to give you an example. That was held in Costa Rica, scientists from, 20, maybe 15, 20 from Chile alone, because it's got such a long coast. And we spent a week with them intensively, but a lot of preparation before to bring the data in. And the data is all over the place. I mean, that's also another major problem. Whale research is recent, and the data it's all over the place in the sense that it's held by all kinds of different groups and bodies and individuals, but it's acoustic data. It's transects, which you're from the air and you're looking in a statistically significant way at, where they're traveling and counting them, boat-based, all the different methods of science. But we had to bring experts together who could assess that and then create what we've created as a hands-on tool. So all these countries that are now starting to plan what to do in their waters, how much is going to be developed for energy and, whether it's wind or wind farms or whatever, which have some impact on cetaceans, fishing, all the shipping that's happening in the ocean. In order for us to have any impact or any say on whether whales are getting hit in certain areas, we have to have our marine mammal layer, our areas available, widely available, so that they can access them. And the bird people taught us a lot. Bird people are usually way ahead of us, or they're always way ahead of us. They've got a lot more money, and I mean us, the marine mammal people, yeah. So, and there are many more bird watchers than there are whale watchers, and so we learn from them, from BirdLife International, which has created these important bird areas, now called important bird and biodiversity areas, all over the world, from 20, 30 years ago. So we're catching up with them, and it's so exciting. I love this project. In December, I'll be in Brazil, and we're doing the other side of South America, the Southwest Atlantic. So with scientists there, so we're just going to keep pushing. Maybe another 5 or 6 years, we'll have the whole ocean done. Then we'll start over again. Then we start over again. Yeah.
Okay, so when you go down in December, you're going out physically in the field and kind of looking and seeing what you see, or is this just like the week intensive of like analyzing the data and speaking with the scientists?
I'll be disappointed if we don't get out on the water. We usually get out on the water, but we're really working with the scientists in a room. It's sad, but that's what it comes to eventually.
Everybody just wants to go play in the field, but then you have to do something with what you learn.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you for that. That is what it comes down to. But you hear great stories, and usually they do take you out on one day, so you get a little bit of a flavor. But yeah, no, it's going to be really exciting. I know a few of the researchers, one of whom actually helped me with whale watching in Brazil in the 1980s, when there was no whale watching anywhere, near there, but he did all this research. So I've been in touch with him for decades. And I mean, he's a very well-known conservationist. Yeah, it'll be great to see him in his own milieu, his own city, and his own town. And he can introduce us to his whales, which is also nice, his right whales.
Yeah. Whales are they're so aware, right? There's so much intelligence there. So I can imagine that the scientists that go out and spend time with them definitely have that sense of proprietariness, right? Like my whales. Let me introduce you to my whales. Do you still feel that way?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No. After being away from northern Vancouver Island for decades, I took my family, my children and my wife, out to northern Vancouver Island, went out on the water, and the first pod that we see are the ones I knew, top-notchest pod. Yeah. Some of the ones had died and I knew that, but there were several that were still alive because they're very long-lived from, 30 years earlier. And it was fantastic. And it was just one of those beautiful summer days, northern Vancouver Island, the smell of the mountains and the sea and whales blowing all around the place. And yeah, and you're just suddenly seeing them and you're thinking, wow, they're still, I mean, I sort of knew they were there, but I didn't know I'd go out and literally 2 hours later, they'd be and actually the same pod. It could have been any number of, other pods from that community.
Oh, that's so cool. That is so cool that worked out like that. You mentioned you have children. We were chatting a little bit about that before the show. And one of your concerns, when you're in your 20s is like, how do I make a career out of this and have a family and support a family doing this? And you said that you actually got to take some of your children, maybe all of your children with you on some of your expeditions. What was that like? Having a family and doing all this traveling and amazing work?
Well, when they were really young, I couldn't take them, or, we had to have kind of close to home trips. And fortunately, we were living in Scotland, so you could see dolphins occasionally right from our town. And then I would, just drag them down the street. So it wasn't too bad, but that was pretty rare. And I think we went as a family to Iceland when they were ranging from about age 7 to 15 or so, 16. And that was magic. We went all around the coast, and because I knew a lot of the whale watchers and had helped set up whale watching in Iceland with workshops a few years before that, everybody took us out for free, and we saw everything. It's a fantastic place. I was a little bit nervous. Are they going to be okay at sea? And we were going far out to sea to try and find blue whales. And it was rough, and they were, I found out they were all good sailors. I had one daughter who just kept asking me the entire time, "How deep is it here, Dad?" She was really worried about the amount of water that was below the boat, to the bottom, which was kind of funny. But
as long as we're floating on it, doesn't matter how deep it is.
something like that, but I thought, but she was a little bit worried. So, but didn't get seasick, but was a little bit worried. But yeah, she's since crossed the Atlantic, so she's gotten over that fear. The youngest is now living in Iceland. He has his degree in conservation science and works with a whale watching company there. So
following in Dad's footsteps.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, we sort of took them to different places. So I had one son who went to Japan with me, and we did some harder things there. Not necessarily whale watching, but we did some. So it varied with the child. Usually, my wife and I would do paired. One child type experiences, and then somebody else gets the chance the next time.
Very cool. Now, does your wife join you on your trips? Is she a researcher as well?
She's a scientist, but she works on this very, very small stuff. She's a cancer scientist. Yeah, so she's working on trying to implement methods for pathways for diagnosing different cancers. So that it's done in a systematic and intelligent way, with blood tests and that sort of thing. Because a lot of people are not getting the right treatment for different things, or the best treatment, let's say. But, she comes along and, enjoys it as well. And we have a lot of exchanges about biology, so it's.
Yeah, right. Just the different spectrums of it, human versus animal, like in the field versus in a lab.
Which is always healthy, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Very cool. Well, at the end of each episode, I have a series of questions I like to ask. And this first one, I'm curious what your answer is. So what is your favorite sea creature and why?
Oh, my goodness.
I know. It's kind of a hard question.
I'm going to be a little bit boring and say orcas because it would be, it wouldn't be right, if I said anything else. And I just, so many different, rich experiences for so long. But there's certainly very special beaked whales, that I like, that are odd for different reasons. There's some of these planktonic creatures that are stunning. I mean, people love, squid and octopus. We're learning more and more about them. Some of the books that are being written recently that are fabulous. I wanted to actually say about the title of the book, Planktonia, because that has a backstory in the sense that it's a book about, Planktonia is not a word in English. But it for me, I was so glad when I came up with it. It's actually a word in Finnish, which means plankton. So only in the Finnish language. I thought, well, what can conjure up this whole world of the Blackwater plankton and the predators that are going after it? So the book covers, also has pictures of some of the predators, largely small ones, but still, squid and octopus definitely want to get in on the action. So they come up when all this vertical migration is happening. And I just thought Planktonia, it's like the world of, this kind of world. It has I don't know, it has a kind of to me, an aura of a fabled world.
It does. It seems it's more than just a plankton, right? It's more than just like the individual. It kind of encompasses, yeah, a whole new world, or a village of it, right? The world of plankton.
Yeah. So yeah, I got a little ways away from your question, but
That's okay. No, I love it. I love the book title. What does the ocean mean to you?
well, the ocean. I mean, it's every. You know, I think we have to think about every second breath is coming from the ocean. It is. We are an ocean planet. It really should be called ocean. That's has been said by other people, but it's profound, but it's also very simple and straightforward and factual. Most of the Earth is ocean. It wouldn't exist. All the life would not exist without it. So I think they estimate 50 to 80% of the production of oxygen comes from the ocean, and that's largely from plankton. And that's phytoplankton, the plant plankton. We wouldn't be able to exist without that. So the ocean is our lifeblood, and we really need to protect it and keep it healthy, and we have a lot of work to do.
If you were given a blank check, unlimited funding for any project or projects up to 3, what would you use the money for?
Well, it's that project I was telling you about, important marine mammal areas. And we have the money to identify all these areas. What we need next is the money to implement them in a way through the conservation of the species and their habitats. And that part of that, I think, is getting researchers out into the field to create, to develop long-term relationships with iconic as well as non-iconic creatures that are out there, and to start to piece together how they live, how they evolve, their ecosystems. And that takes a lot of money. So I would put it's tempting. When you said any amount of money, I think that really, because you posed the question to me even before we're talking now, and it was kind of disturbing, actually. What would I do? But I think I think that'd be where it would have to go, because I think that would make the biggest difference that I could somehow prod and help make it happen.
So this kind of goes with like the 30 by 30, right? Putting aside these marine protected areas.
30% of the ocean protected by 2030. Yeah, that's part of it. Effective.
That's great. And so the money would be, it's not just, I don't know if people understand, maybe some of my listeners, we've talked about MPAs before on the show, but like getting an MPA in place isn't just, a group of scientists getting together and saying, hey, we've seen orcas, killer whales, for example, right? In this area, it's vitally important. This is it. It's officially a protected area. Done. Walk out of the room. Wipe your hands, right? It's you have to go to the lawmakers and the policymakers, and it's like years, sometimes a decade or more of going back and forth of, okay, well, what other stakeholders have in place here? And then once it's actually, okay, this is the area, and it may have changed shape since the initial proposal, but once you get to that point, which is lots of time and money in and of itself, now what? Now you have to reinforce it. There has to be, or educate people so that they know about it. Because if they don't know about it, or if they know about it and don't care, and there's not that stick to keep them from caring or make them care, then it doesn't have any teeth, and it's just paper, right? It's just a piece of paper that nobody cares about. So that's where all that money could go.
Perfectly illustrating. It is a complex, long process and expensive, working with all the stakeholders and trying to make something that works with the other uses that we need from the sea, that we want to have, available. But if we don't manage it in a sustainable way, we're not going to have a future, really. So it's incredibly important to put that time in and do it.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. What is your favorite field story or stories to tell? And this could be an amazing day on the field, which you've already shared some incredible stories already, or it could be a day where things happened and it makes a great story now.
Yeah, I don't know. I was starting to think that it was, there's so many amazing times. I guess one of the ones was what I was starting to describe of coming back after that first summer, because we had no idea whether we would find the whales again, whether they'd, if it'd be the same whales, killer whales, orcas, and what it would be like there. And it's, to come back. And then again, we saw some of the same whales, Wavy and Stubbs and Nicola, on first or second time that we were back. And, it was a day that just is kind of fixed in your mind. You're on this sailboat and it's really moving and there's all kinds of stuff going on out there, and suddenly you see blows. You've been looking for them, and you see the blows, the spouts in the distance, and they're coming right for you. And I think that sense of when they were actually coming over to us after being away all winter, because you can see them during the winter, but the weather is so poor there, consistently through the winter, and it's dark and stormy, that summer is by far the best time. And it's also when the orcas come into the estuaries to feed on salmon, and and they rest and they play and they rub on the beaches and all that stuff. So that was, it was that sense of being part of their community almost. And I always think of the times we were on boats when they were just all around us, and we weren't trying to do anything. We're just kind of living there with them. It was very much like living with orcas in a way, and I thought that was, wow, what a great, how lucky, and what a great feeling. You think of those books about living with elephants, the scientists that go to Africa and do that, and it was sort of like doing that with orcas, which hadn't been thought about before that, before people started doing that during that time. So yeah, I think that's certainly one of the highlights.
The return, the great return. Very cool. At the end of each episode, I like to leave the listeners with a conservation ask to go forth and bring into the world. What would you like my listeners to take from your episode today?
Kara, I think people who hear this and are inspired, or are inspired anyway about the ocean, go down to the sea. Or if you're not inspired, especially if you're not inspired by the ocean, go down to the sea and take a deep breath, and run along the beach, or spend some time just staring out to sea and thinking about the amazing ocean and the planet that we live on. And, look inside yourself and think, what could you contribute to make it better? What are your tools that you could do or acquire, or learn? And it could be as simple as picking up litter that you see that might have flowed into the ocean. Or, it could be something, giving money to groups that are doing it, that are trying to save species and ecosystems. It could be a lot of different things, but I think we need to look inside. We need to personalize it, to really make it. This is not about somebody on paper who said there's, a climate emergency and
Right.
we need to do something. I mean, yes, that's important, and we should do all the things to be precautionary about all that, and now we're seeing evidence of it. But I think if you get down to the down to the ocean. And I think if you're far inland, go down to the nearest river because they all flow into the ocean. I mean, there's only a finite amount of water on this planet. All the water circulates, within it. Goes up sometimes as rain comes down, but it's all one system when you look at it. And the dolphins discovered that there's so many river dolphins that are swimming up a couple thousand miles up the Amazon and that sort of thing. Well, those are sea creatures. They started in the sea as we did. We're sea creatures, and it's all of that is connected in a real way. I think trying to bring that to your consciousness, if you can do that, is highly motivating.
I love that. I love the idea of just everyone going out and connecting with nature, right? And it is kind of overwhelming to think about all the things, right? So you just focus on what's going on, what can I see, what do I feel that's going on, and what can I control, what can I do, right? So love it. Great conservation ask. All right. Well, I had so much fun chatting with you today. If listeners want to find you, connect with you, learn more about you and or your new book, Planktonia, which I really loved reading and looking at the pictures, listeners, you guys should definitely check out a copy. If listeners want to do all these things, where's the best place to do so?
Well, Planktonia you can get on from any bookstore. You may have to order it, and certainly online you can order it from the various online retailers. It's out now. If you want more information on my work, I have a website with my name, erichhoyt.com, and our important marine mammal area work is accessible through marinebio.life, marinebio.life, all one word. And my other work with Whale and Dolphin Conservation is accessible through whales.org. So fairly straightforward access.
Perfect. And I'll put a link to that and everything else we chatted about in the show notes today. Was there something else you wanted to add?
No, that's great. If you've got show notes. And, I'm on Twitter with my name, easy to find. It's all the same spelling, just my name for Twitter and Facebook. Perfect. And I'm posting things all the time about all the exciting developments. So.
Perfect. Well, Erich, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really enjoyed our chat.
Thank you, Kara. It was great. I really enjoyed it as well. Thanks.
Hey, one more thing. Do you want to dive more into the ocean and marine biology? Need a little guidance on ocean conservation? Head on over to marinebio.life/resources. We've got book recommendations, job posting pages, conference suggestions, and ocean-friendly products. All recommendations have been personally vetted by me, and I will continue to add to the collection as I come across cool things to share. Head on over to marinebio.life/resources to learn more. See you over there. Thank you for listening to today's show. I'd love to hear any insight you've gleaned. Leave a comment in the show notes or send me an email over at marinebio.life. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a review and, of course, share with your friends. If you want more resources for ocean news, including conservation topics and careers, plus personal insight from me that I just don't share anywhere else, join me at marinebio.life and sign up for email updates. Keep after your dreams and making waves in your community. One person can make a difference. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll catch you next time on the So You Want to Be a Marine Biologist podcast.